Hello patrons, and welcome to our final tutorial for July. Today's video is going to be a little bit different in terms of how I came to the subject matter. This is the painting I painted for the second tutorial in July, and if you haven't already watched that video, I would at least recommend watching like the introduction to it and me talking kind of about why I'm doing this piece. And then you can also skip towards the end of that video if you're not watching the whole thing to kind of hear my resolve on what had happened during that painting. So the really short version of it, I'll try and make it short anyway, is that I wanted to paint with gouache, with the new M-gram gouache samples that I had, and we had a request for scales, and I thought it would be really cool to do this tortoise with this really stylized version of the legs with the gouache laying, the light gouache laying on top of the dark gouache. And that worked fine. That worked like what I imagined in my head. But then I felt like we got a little bit lost in here. It looks okay, but it's pretty busy. And as I was working on this piece, I thought, you know, this would look a lot different in watercolor, and it would be really fun to see a side-by-side comparison of how I approached this one versus one in watercolor. So I have redrawn the image onto a new sheet of paper. It's the same type of paper and everything. And I taped it to my board. This is just a canvas board like from Michaels, and I covered it in packing tape so that it's easy to get the masking tape off of it. And so I didn't have to draw it again. I did draw the other one by hand on camera if you're interested in seeing that. There were some proportion issues with that, admittedly, and for this one, since I've already drawn it and we're just trying to save a little bit of time in the grand scheme of things, I went ahead and traced this one. The proportions will be a little bit better in this one. The nose isn't quite as long, but other than that, they're pretty darn comparable in terms of what we'll be working with. I am going to use my Smith Watercolors. This is the first palette that I ever set up, and we're going to pretty much stay in this range here with a little bit of help from our ultramarine and or neutral tint. We'll kind of see when we get there how many shortcuts we want to take today. So yeah, the image, if you haven't seen the other video that I'm using, is this one from Pixabay. It's a cute little tortoise, and there will be a link to the picture in the video's description. And I'm just going to set that up on my phone in front of me so that I can see it. You can go ahead and pull yours up on a web browser. And I think we're ready to jump on in. So I did talk a bit about in the first video, so I don't want to completely talk your ears off if you've already listened to that one, about being unsure about publishing that one and wanting to make sure you guys have quality content. And I don't want you to feel like I am cheating you by giving you the same subject in two videos, but I honestly feel like this is going to be a very different result, and the way that I'm approaching it is going to be completely different as well. So I hope that it's valuable for you to see these side by side and kind of see the different ways that I am approaching them. So what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some of my yellow ochre with some of like the dirty gray and brown that was on my palette already, just to kind of knock it back a little bit. And then I'm diluting that to be a nice light wash. Now I kept trying to do this in the gouache tutorial because I'm so used to working from light to dark, because that's what we do in watercolors, but in gouache you need to work the other way around to retain your highlights really. So in that video I kind of went back and forth and tried to find a good balance. But I just want to go ahead and spread this whole color, and this feels a little bit relieving to be able to just kind of plop everything down and have it spread over the page so quickly. Another issue in that video is that the samples that I had from the gouache were dried in pans, and I finally at the end of that video admitted, as much as I've been searching for gouache that I can leave in a pan or in a palette, I admitted that that is just probably not ideal, at least if you're working in something over than small sketchbook size paper. This even is sketchbook size paper, and these larger areas of the legs and the shells were so hard to fill in with that little gouache pan and trying to get enough color to really cover everything. So I'm just doing a nice big underwash. The space in between, like the neck and the head, or the leg and the head, isn't too important because it's going to be super dark later, so we're not going to see any of this lighter color in those areas. I'm using my silver black velvet size 8, and we are on Aqua paper today. I'm going to be putting these in a sketchbook to cover some whoops pages, and that's pages that I didn't really like and don't enjoy looking at. So I'm going to cover them up so that I can enjoy looking at that sketchbook again. I'm trying to get in the habit with my new Hanamulla sketchbook that I just want to make sure I take pride in each piece that I do in there and really try and turn them into something really great. But this is an older sketchbook that had some interesting decisions I made in terms of what I wanted to put on the different pages. There's some swatching pages that just feel out of place with the rest of the sketches, and I'd eventually like to do a sketchbook tour for you guys on YouTube because I know that's been asked about several times. And I want to make sure that they're all worth showing off. Not that they have to be great examples or anything, I just want them to be a little bit more cohesive as a unit. So we've got our first layer down. One thing that you guys might have enjoyed in the gouache video is I hardly had to use my heat tool at all, but being back in watercolor, we're going to go ahead and let this dry, and I'll be right back. Alright, the next thing that I want to do is I kind of want to work from the background elements forward, just in terms of our level of detail. So I'm going to go ahead and mix up kind of a dirtier brown here, still a light color, but a little more brown, a little less yellow. And we're going to kind of go into some of these areas with the shell and try and put in some tonal values. I do want to keep in mind that we want the focus to be on the face of our tortoise, and we talked about this a lot in the other video, and that means that we want to soften elements that are blurred out, and the photograph can really help you with that because the aperture that they used was pretty small, meaning that the only thing that's really in focus is the head and the front leg. And while you don't always have to identically match your reference photo, I personally, coming from a photography background, really like when the backgrounds are kind of blurred out and we can kind of just soften off our edges. So that is the look I am going to aim for. I do want to keep the texture pretty loose on this leg. Again, it's out of focus. But I do want there to be texture there for sure because this is a nice bumpy little creature. So I'm going to leave some of the first layer showing there, and then we'll build layers on top of that. Coming underneath the shell, if I am remembering correctly, it's been a while since I put on my turtle educator hat. The bottom of the shell is called a plastron. And this is the carapace, plastron carapace. And we're just going to put in a little bit more gradation. There's this interesting striped pattern that I really struggled with the gouache, because I wanted to put lines like this in like I would with watercolor, and just given my inexperience with gouache, I had a really hard time figuring out how to put those colors in a effective manner. I'm going to soften the areas on the top and the bottom of these striations and just kind of blend them together. We're going to put some darker tones in the center here. And then we've got like one more big one that comes up on this side. As well as there's some darker tones underneath here. Taking a second to just kind of survey everything. I'm going to hit it with the heat tool again. We're going to mix up more of our light brown and water that down. And I'm going to come into this area here, and there's like a little lip. And we want to soften this off. And then kind of bring this texture up into the shell. I'm looking for those mid-tones in the reference photo to better help me decide where to put some of these darker tones. There's a big dark stripe on that front one, and we haven't gotten to that yet. There's very little definition on these ones back here, so I'm just going to go ahead and drop in a little bit of color and not pay too much focus to them. And while that is drying, we can go ahead and put some darker tones down on this leg. Now with this brush, the Silver Black Velvet, you're going to see me reloading the palette a lot. The Silver Black Velvet holds a lot of water, and if we wanted to be more economical about this, where is it? I can have my other Silver Black Velvet, this is a size 6, on standby to be more of like the softening off brush, so we don't have to rinse our brush every time. I'll show you what I mean by that if you're not sure. I'm going to reinforce this edge a bit more. Still going to get much, much darker in that area, but I just want it to have a nice foundation for when we start working on the face. Here I said I was going to use this other brush, and I haven't done that yet, but that's okay. We want to use some shadows to depict kind of where these values come into play. I should switch my hands, really. We should mix with our smaller brush because it holds less paint, which means less wasted when you rinse it out. Same thing over here. We're just reinforcing the edge of the leg with some negative painting. It's really remarkable how much more in my element I feel. Gouache is a type of watercolor, but you approach it like you would approach like an acrylic in terms of the way that you layer colors and start with your darker tones. And with other subjects that I've done in gouache, I've really enjoyed the freedom, but I've also picked animals that were more based on shape and not as much detail, like these scales that I've been working on in this tortoise. And there's more detail, which I'm already not super strong at. Using a different medium for that can be really challenging, and that's okay. I learned so much in that painting, and I'm hoping to learn even more through this process of doing it in watercolor as well. So the last kind of areas of color that we want to drop into the shell are those really dark grays. So I'm using my ultramarine. It's just off camera, I think, for you. And I'm mixing that with the burnt umber to get a warmish gray. And we're going to very carefully try and place in some of that there. I came down too far here, but not much I can do about it at this point, so we're just going to go with it. There's one on this one as well. I don't know specifically what type of tortoise this is. There are several species, and I'm not a turtle expert. So off the top of my head, without doing research, I'm not sure which one we're looking at. For this last one here that I did, I'm going to soften that off with a lot of water, just because we want that to be more out of focus. Could even start to do that on this one. And certainly on the one over here. That shouldn't be a staining color, but we've talked about this before on the Aqua paper, that it's a very grabbing paper. Mixing up a little bit more of this dark gray. Put a little bit more definition in here. I'm doing some vertical type of lines because there are some lighter striations within that area. I think we need our heat tool again. This is going to require a lot of layers, so I apologize. I'll try and cut them out for you. Alright, I'm going to need to mix up a lot more of our darker color, and I think to do that, I'm going to cheat a tiny bit. We're still going to add ultramarine in so we have that hue. That grayish, earthy tone, but I'm also going to bring in a little bit of neutral tint just to quicken up the process. So I've got a brownish gray here. It's nice and dark. And I'm just going to go ahead and come in here and we're going to drop in this real dark shadow. Behind the head. Sorry, I know I do that. Stop mid-sentence when I'm concentrating. Then with our clean brush, we're just going to fade those edges out. On this front leg, actually, it's a pretty dark outline for the scales that are coming off the leg. Didn't mean to come down quite so far here. Got too excited. And we're just carrying that color into the tops of these grooves. And then also there's a darker shadow underneath here. We're out of color again, so I'm going to mix up some more. This neutral tint I'm using is staining. It's Daniel Smith's neutral tint. But if you can imagine that we couldn't lift the burnt umber and the ultramarine off, you're really not going to be able to mix or lift the neutral tint mix up off of the page. So just be aware of that when you're going to put things in. we're also going to be able to get that small aperture, or wide aperture rather, look where this is nice and faded out, because that's what watercolors do for us. We can have these nice soft wet and wet edges. Just a much different look. And I'll show you the gouache side by side, of course, before we're finished here. I just dropped some water into those areas. It's a little bit dirty, but we're just going to be putting gray paint on it anyway, so. I'm going to go ahead and take our mixture here and water it down a bit, and then add some of the burnt umber. To bring some of our carapace dividers in. And then, as much as I've been putting it off, we should work on our scales over here on the feet. So again, with a dark brown mixture, I'm going to go ahead and start to drop in some shadows. I need this to be at a better angle for myself, though. Let's tilt you guys so you're not looking at it so crooked. So I'm going to be going underneath where the shadow ridges are and using negative painting to paint in the scales. We're not going to do every single one. I'm using the very tip of my brush. The reason I'm using the larger brush for this is because it has a better point than my size 6. My size 6 is older. I've worn it out a lot more. And I'm not using a super teeny tiny brush because it wouldn't hold a lot of pigment. I haven't reloaded yet. And I find it more convenient to have more of a reserve. I want to be really careful that the space in between the scales is more narrow and that the shadows underneath them are heavier. And you kind of want to think about the depth of field as well. You can look at the reference to kind of see this as well, but the most in focus is here at the top of the leg, and as we get down here it's going to be softer. So that tells me when we get down here I should be using my clean brush to just soften off these edges a bit, make them a little bit more fuzzy. And we can also soften the undersides. I'm not going to do it to the lines in between, but we can try and soften the shadows of the scales. We're just going to soften off some more of these edges. Not with so much water. This paper is very good for doing glazes because it locks in that pigment so much that we're going to be able to go over the top of it and have it not blur too much. I'm going to go ahead and just straight up go over this whole side with a wash to deepen that color. We have some of that over on this side too, but we need to wait for those washes to dry first. These ones were already mostly dry. So let me go ahead and hit that with the heat tool. I'm also going to drop in our dark colors on this side. That'll also help us with the tonal values that we need. I'm going to go ahead and take our lighter brown from before with the yellow ochre. That was mixed with a bit of the burnt umber, sorry. And we're just going to kind of, I don't want to do a big wash of them, but I want to put in some texture. So I'm going to go into each scale. I'm going to start underneath that shadowed area and leave the tips of the scales the lightest color. And when I run out of pigment, I'm just going back to areas that has a lot of the water sitting there and picking that up until it's fairly evenly distributed, and then we can go ahead and grab some more. And go ahead and put in a little bit more color down here as well. Oh, I missed glazing, you guys. I did. You really can't glaze with gouache effectively because it's just going to lift up the paint underneath it. Unless you get acrylic gouache, I guess, which I haven't used before, but I don't quite understand the difference between why you'd want to use acrylic gouache or acrylic. I guess one is still, no, I don't even know. I was gonna say, I guess one has the polymer binder, one has gum arabic, but that can't even be true because the binder has to be different for it to not be water soluble when it lifts. So if you guys know, you can let me know. It's not something I've looked into at all, so I don't know about it. I'm just gonna go in here with a little bit of my darker mixture. It's still damp. And just kind of drop in some shadows that kind of fade off this edge. Really need to darken up this edge that it's going to contrast with. I think I didn't come down anywhere near as far enough as I was supposed to here. I'm going to go back to that yellow ochre mixture, same one we put on this leg here, with a bit of brown in it. Just going to glaze a little bit of color over the top of our darker tones here. Spot it in so we have some lighter patches still. This is some of the burnt umber. Take the watered down gray and just put some more definition in here. It's getting really light. I do want it to have a little bit more definition than that. Okay, just take a second to breathe it in. I feel like our shell is a little too brown and not quite enough yellow, so I'm actually going to take some permanent yellow light, mix it in with my yellow ochre, and we're just going to do a nice light glaze here. Oop. Just want to gently follow the grain of whichever scoot you're on. We can also put some of that yellow mixture down here. I think that might help. It's lacking a little bit of dimension. All right. I think we only have the face left. I am going to take a little bit of a break though, give my back a rest so that I'm not rushing through it, since this is going to be the hardest part, and I will come back to you guys in a little bit. Okay, patrons, I am back. So I've got my size 6 here still, and then I also pulled out my Escoda Perla for some detail work, and we're going to move on to our face. So as we get more detailed here, we want to make sure that we are conveying the tortoise in a, I don't know, like a hello everyone. Okay, welcome back. So we're going to go ahead and get started on the face. I'm using some of my smaller brushes now. I've got the size 6 silver black velvet like I had before, and then I also have the Escoda Perla on standby, and I'm going to be creating some glazes here, and I want to make sure that these are not solid washes. I want them to have some texture to them to help us with the image, and these are going to be in, if you look at the reference photo, there's like a base layer that the tortoise is colored, and that's that light tannish color. And then he's got some dirt on him, which is that darker brown, and then there's some of the darker scale tone towards his face, which is like the gray color. So we're going to be building this up in layers. The brown that's on top of his head, I'm just kind of splotching in here. It's not going to be precise. And then as we get into some of the other color selections, we'll be a little bit more particular with how we lay our colors down. So right now I just want to get in some base tones, or I guess second base tones. Cricket is very sad that she's not in the center of attention right now. Are you leaving us, Cricket? Yep, there she goes. There she goes, out the door. I kind of moved my brush around the edges, even though this paper is not going to lift super well. I did want to blend the brown into those edges a little bit. I'm going to take careful note of, on this image here, in my brain at least, because this is on top, my head wants to cast a shadow, my brain wants to cast a shadow underneath it, but the facial color is actually darker than the plastron of the shell. So we're not going to put a drop shadow down there. Instead, we are going to define it on top, but we are going to wait for our browns to dry before we do that. We are going to, well, maybe we won't wait for the browns to dry. I think we can start placing some gray tones down without interrupting too much. I'm going to start with this eye here. It's going to bleed a little bit into the washes that are still wet. It's going to get a little bit tricky here because we're going to start covering up our under drying. It's going to get harder to see. There's always a point in the drawing that happens. And it's always one of my least favorite parts just because it's a little nerve-wracking. Trying to retain some of these scales under the chin before we come down here with our darker wash that's going to separate the jaw from the scale under, or the shell underneath. Make sure we don't lose our ear. Mixing up some more of a dark brown. Into a gray. We're going to try and lightly glaze some of that up here. Sorry I always get so quiet at the end of these things. I never quite know what to say when we're in these final stages of just fine-tuning back and forth and back and forth. Doing as much as I can with this slightly larger brush before I switch to the smaller one. I'm going to hit this with the heat tool. We'll go in with the little brush and see what we can do about finishing it off. Just like we did with the gouache piece, we're going to go ahead and start with the eye so that we can just get a hold on like an anchoring point. I'm using a neutral tint for this, but you can mix your burnt umber and ultramarine or use a black or whatever you want to do. I'm not going to save a highlight. We're just going to go ahead and put that in with our ink later on. I know he looks a bit demonic right now. We'll fix it with the highlight, don't worry. You can save it if you want to. We saved a bit with the gouache. We're going to start to put in those darker lines that create the scale shape. This is the space between the scales looking down into the skin. We don't want it to be completely black, but a nice dark brownish gray would be great. And we talked about this in the gouache video, but if you wanted to instead do each scale individually, you can do that if that is your style. For me, that causes more stress and I don't quite enjoy it, so I prefer to do these washes that make it look a little bit more unified. Makes it look a bit more like the dirt goes from one scoop to the next without any interruption. But if you like it the other way, you can do them one by one. You do want to be very light-handed with this. We don't want to go in too dark, or too thick, rather, because these lines are very fine. We don't want it to look like these lines are drawn on top of the tortoise. We want them to be part of the tortoise's body. As we get off towards the back of the head, it does soften off again, so we want to make sure that we don't get too detailed back there. Same thing when we come up to this part. Get up here, we can soften off our edges a bit more. You can go in here with a damp brush and just try and loosen up any areas we feel like got away from us a little bit. And I'm going to add some of the yellow I was using earlier. If I can get a pure enough little version of it. And drop that into the beak. And some of the surrounding areas as we kind of fade off into the rest of the head. I'm going to get out our ink. This is the ink I always use, the Bleedproof White. I know I use it a lot, but it's funny to think, like I use it only for details, but it's about a third gone, maybe a little more than a third gone. Didn't expect to go through it like that, just because I use it in such small areas, but I guess I do use it frequently enough that that happens. So I mix up the ink to a paintable consistency, but then I want to rinse off my brush so that I'm not carrying around a ton of extra pigment in there. Then I get it just on the very tip of the liner. Then we can go ahead and come into areas that need more definition. Let me go ahead and try and lift out a little bit of the color in the front of the eye here to make it more gray rather than black. So we have a little bit of variation going on here, and then I will load the black in at the edges. Go back to a clean brush and just a little bit of ink on the tip. And I'm going to look for anywhere I see highlights on the shell or on the scales that would help add variation and definition to our little turtle. Adding a bit more black to bring this beak up just a little bit more. There's a little crack in his beak as well. Softening off the ink lines here to try and get I didn't quite lay it down thin enough. So let's try that again. This might be a fun piece to do like a hybrid on. Do all these underlayers with watercolor, and then once we get to the head, lay in some gouache to try and add a little bit more contrast, because the watercolors, sometimes we lose some of those highlights. But if we use all gouache, then it gets really heavy. So after I show you these at the end of it, you could always see what elements you like of each piece and let me know. I'll leave a comment too in the post, so you guys can tell me what you liked better about one or the other. We want to be careful in these areas that are softer not to put our lines too harshly, just because we don't want it to seem out of place. But I do want a little bit of catch light there. Readjusting the picture on my screen. Really actually tentative to put any of these striations in white, just because I feel like we did a good job at these tonal values up here, so I don't want to get too crazy with it and take away from that. Just a couple of highlights over here. Alright, well it turns out, as I'm looking at this, I just am not good at turtle faces. So perhaps it didn't have anything to do with the gouache in the first one. I definitely feel like this is not what I had envisioned, but it's okay. I hope that you guys do even better than me and show me your pictures. Show me how awesome your turtles are. Yeah, it just got too busy, I think. I think it's very similar. So turtles have given me trouble, elephants give me trouble, rhinos surprisingly not. I feel like they're easier to get a hold of. I'm really afraid of doing primates because they have a lot of detail in their face, but you have to find the balance between the detail and the looseness of watercolor. So I think it's just like this, it's not similar types of animals, but animals that have similar types of features in terms of painting characteristics. So definitely interesting to kind of learn that during this whole process of these two paintings. I'm going to take off this tape real quick. Sorry it's not super satisfying since there isn't an edge. I do want to show you guys these side by side with this big clunky board out of the way. All the way back. Here we go. All right, we got them both in here. So watercolor, gouache. I actually like the eye better on the gouache side. I like the little highlight soup I was able to get there. The proportions are actually more similar than I thought they would be, and actually I thought this was longer. It looks like it's just not as wide, maybe. So those are off a little bit with just the drawing. I like both of these legs for different reasons. I like the stylized version of this one, and I also like the softness of this one, looking more like the photograph, having that kind of bouquet in the back. I like the legs up front for different reasons. This has more definition to it, but this is more stylized once again. I definitely think that this undershell on the tortoise on this one was more successful. I do like this piece of this shell on this side better, again, because it has that stylized look, but I think that we better rendered the shell in the other areas. So yeah, it's a matter of personal preference, I think. I'd like to know which one you like better, and let me know which one you like better working with, gouache or watercolor. I assume that most of us work with watercolor, given that it's a watercolor channel, but if you'd like to see more gouache content, let me know. Thank you guys for hanging with me during this intense learning project, and I will see you guys in the next video. Let me know if you have any more requests for the videos in August. It's already August. Don't know how that happened. Alright, I'll see you guys soon. Bye.